Welcome to, I think, the 13th edition of the Impact Narrative after 12th. There's a mystery one, the kind of the one which was never broadcast because it was far too good. So the 12th then, I think. But anyway, somewhere around that. And this is a very special edition of the Impact Narrative, our all singing, all dancing, all talking, kind of review of current events at home and abroad, including such things as football and Arsenal, the two things being different. And this is a rather special edition because we're joined by a mystery guest. We're in the room here of Dr.Simon Mabon of Lancaster University, and we're joined here by satellite, or Skype, whatever it's called, by Dr. Simon Mabon, who's currently at a university called Harvard. He's just waved. He's probably not visible. We're hoping he's visible. We're hoping this experiment will work. Obviously at the moment lots of things are happening, particularly in the Middle East, and so I'll now transfer you to my friend across the pond, and I'm sure Simon has quite a few things to say about Syria, and so without further ado, over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. It's nice to be here. Nice to see my office looking tidier than yours, as per usual, and nice to be joining you both for the Impact Narrative. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Mark, I thought it was probably appropriate for us to do this, even though, as you say, I'm across the pond. Although I should say I'm currently in Florida rather than at Harvard. I was at Harvard a couple of days ago. I'm heading to DC in a couple of days. Scratch that. I'm heading to DC today.
That's the jet lag.
To talk about events in the Middle East, to talk about Saudi Arabia, to talk about Syria, to talk about Iran. So I thought that given everything that had happened over the weekend, on Friday night, the US, UK, France strikes on Syria, I thought it was probably really important for us to get together to have a talk about what had happened politically, what had happened in terms of the lead up to this. Lead up to the strikes, and why they took place, and where we go from here.
Good. I'll keep prompting you, don't worry. I'm nodding vigorously.
Okay, excellent.
Good. And so you were saying about the situation on the ground. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, but you also talk about the reasons for the strike, rationale for the strike. So you're going to kind of do a scene-setting preamble then.
Yeah, so it's worth a step back about.
Oh.
And a week ago we saw a chemical weapon strike in Douma. There was another chemical weapon strike for the Syrian people, who've been subjected to 30 odd, possibly even 40. It's contested chemical weapon strikes, the majority of which have been undertaken by the Assad regime. There is some debate as to whether this was a chemical weapons attack carried out by the Assad regime or not. There were allegations that it was a quote-unquote false flag event, that it was undertaken by rebel groups to try and frame the Assad regime in a negative light. The Russians suggested that the British were involved, that the British were complicit. But that all tells you something, that there was this chemical weapons attack, and immediately afterwards there was an effort to frame complicity, an effort to frame guilt. But if you look at the context, you look at the precedent, you look at the political scene, there's only one really likely source of chemical weapons attacks, and that was the Assad regime. Now, I've spoken to people from the team that were tasked with getting chemical weapons out of Syria in 2012, 2013. And they said to me, look, we weren't able to get them all. We knew that we hadn't got them all. We tried our best, but we knew that we only got 70, 80% of them. And we got a Nobel Prize for that, which is excellent. They did a wonderful job. But there are still people dying from chemical weapons attacks across Syria. So I think that given there's a precedent of the Assad regime using them, given that Assad is the one who is hands down winning this conflict, he's destroying the Syrian population, killing 500,000 people, displacing 11, 12 million people from their homes, destroying the lives of a generation, and destroying the infrastructure of state, there's little doubt, I think, that it was the Assad regime who was guilty. So that's the act. And then in the aftermath, there's been a lot of talk of red lines. Going back to 2012, US President Barack Obama said, there is a red line, and that red line is the use of chemical weapons. Now, the Assad regime passed that red line. It stepped over it, and nothing happened. But recently, French President Emmanuel Macron said there is a red line, and that red line is the use of chemical weapons. Now, it seems to be that this French red line has been drawn in much thicker, permanent marker than the former red line of Barack Obama. So it seems to me that there was a real desire to do something about this transgression of the French red line. And that's where we get to late Friday night in the US, and the press conference given by President Trump about strikes that were taking place on Syria through a coalition of US, UK, and French planes.
So hang on. The tweet that he sent out, the missiles are coming and whatever.
Yes.
So are you kind of almost implying there that Trump's hand has been forced to some degree by the French?
Not necessarily. I think there have been discussions previously between Mr. Macron and Mr. Trump to say that, look, we can't let this go on any further. I think that bringing the French into this little alliance is actually quite a shrewd move to say this isn't just a sort of US-UK strike as we saw in Iraq, as we've seen elsewhere, that this is a UK, US and European strike, sort of giving it the air of more of a European, more of a Western act of intervention.
Right.
But Mr. Trump has been very clear that this can't go on, that the Assad regime is guilty of heinous crimes. And in that sense, he's certainly right. There have been some truly abhorrent acts of violence and barbarism by the Assad regime. And it's sort of breaking diplomatic protocol, but his tweet saying that the missiles are coming was seemingly a knee-jerk response to this act. And I think it didn't particularly help anything, but it showed how strongly he was committed to punishing the Assad regime and saying you can't get away with this. Now, it took a week or so to get to the point where strikes were taking place on Syria. And I think that tells you a lot about the types of diplomatic wrangling that was going on, the types of dialogue, the discussions and the debate that was taking place not only within the White House and within Number 10, but also between three actors, trying to figure out what was a proportional response, what was a legal response, and what was normatively the right thing to do to stop Assad from using chemical weapons on his own people again. And I think that's why it took a week or so to actually see any type of military response.
Yeah, and one might also say a certain amount of dialogue behind the scenes with the Russians. Do you think? Because it would seem to me possible, at any rate, that there would be some sort of attempt to make sure that Russian personnel weren't going to be in the firing line. So what do you think? I mean, this is perhaps not something that you've spoken to people about, but is it not possible that Russia was trying to deter the attack taking place, then when it was clear that they weren't going to succeed in deterring it, that then there was some kind of deal to make sure that it didn't escalate?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that it's worth thinking that the extent to which those conversations took place is contingent on the type of relationship that is, or the nature of the relationship between the US and Russia, and the UK and Russia. Obviously, there are a lot of issues in those relationships right now. It's quite a rocky road, but I'm sure that there was a form of dialogue, if not necessarily a discussion about it, then a warning to say we are going to strike against these targets. We don't want to do any damage to you. You will want to get out of bases if you have any resources there.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine that's something. Otherwise, we'd have seen a much stronger Russian response than just the vocal condemnation. And that's certainly what spoken to have thought as well.
Right. Yeah. The obvious question, and it seems you've kind of answered it. The obvious question on the minds of a lot of people is that this kind of thing has happened on numerous occasions before. The red line has been crossed many times,
Yes.
but this time the red line actually meant something because of Macron rather than of. Because I would imagine that chemical attacks have taken place, not being totally au fait with all of the atrocities, but that the red line is being crossed while Mr. Trump's been in the White House before. But on this occasion, yeah. And so...
That's true as well, yeah.
And the suspicion that the White House was a bit more inclined to take this kind of step because of things that have happened in Britain recently, because of the Salisbury incident. So you don't think there's no link there at all? That
some people I've spoken to have said that there is a...
Right.
Some people have said that we should view this as the UK sending a message to Russia.
Yeah.
Now, I think that would be quite a foolhardy response to things, because
yeah,
I'm slightly removed from the UK right now by a few thousand miles. But as far as I'm aware, there's not been a very clear conclusion to the Salisbury investigation.
No.
And without that, I think it would be a bit of a gamble to be sending a military message.
Yeah. No, my feeling would be, in fact, the reverse, that because things are so bad between Britain and Russia, that we would be more reluctant to get involved in a thing like this. And this is why I think Mr. Corbyn has kind of accused Mrs. May of being Trump's poodle. It's not only that she was clearly waiting to find out what he was really going to do before she committed herself, but also just this feeling that things have got so bad with Russia that the very last thing we want to do is to get into a kind of a hot conflict, even a proxy conflict in the Middle East. So I would tend to think, the worse things get with Russia, the less likely that we are to do anything to provoke Russia any further.
I see the position as well. And Mark, you mentioned Mr. Corbyn and Mrs. May, and perhaps you can shed a bit of light on how things are playing out there, because when I was leaving, there was a lot of talk from Mr. Corbyn that suggested that he hadn't firmly made up his mind that it was the Assad regime. There hadn't been a strong condemnation of Assad. We know that his politics are certainly anti-imperial, and that type of anti-imperialism has, in the past, led to tacit support, if not more vocal support, for regimes like Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah.
So, how is this playing out in the political sphere then in the UK?
Right. Okay. Well, I just heard, in fact, the beginnings of a debate in the House of Commons. There was one yesterday, and there's a rerun of it going on right now as we speak. On Tuesday afternoon, and Mr. Corbyn opened with really, I think what he's trying to do is to say that it's improper that this action took place without a debate in Parliament, and that's kind of the safe ground on which he can lay a marker down, saying that he disagrees with this kind of thing without being associated too much with the Assad regime. My sense is what he's done is the same thing he's done about Russia, that he's said this is a deplorable thing that's happened, as in the Salisbury incident, but we need concrete proof. And I think people within the Labour Party have been forced to say that the most likely culprit is the Assad regime, but they're still saying this is only probability rather than certainty, and that this is the kind of the problem with their position. On the one hand, they're almost saying Parliament should have been reassembled to discuss this before action was taken. However, that's implying that Parliament would have been therefore entitled to authorise action before there was proof. Because the Cabinet reassembled last week to discuss this, Corbyn saying Parliament should have been summoned back at the same time. Well, if that happened and a decision was taken, then that would have implied that we had proof. So really, it's the usual, without trying to make any kind of partisan point here at all. It's the usual Corbyn cake and eat it thing. That if you can't attack the government for doing things precipitately, you can attack them for doing things without proper constitutional, and now he's saying that we should have something like a War Powers Act, which is, I'm sure, as you know, in America is so easily evaded. When action takes place without any warning, then clearly Congress, Parliament can't be summoned, and there are other ways of getting around it. But I mean, but the thing that's interesting is that people are saying that there has been a constitutional convention since the Iraq War, that Parliament should be consulted before military action is taken. But this is very much like these other incidents where there was at least theoretically time to consult Parliament, because there was an agreement to take military action, but it clearly wasn't because of a urgent and immediate threat to our country. It was because we wanted to take action against a regime, you know, that you know, in other words, that like Iraq, it's a kind of predetermined course of action which could or might not be influenced by Parliament. Yeah. So, sorry, Simon.
I wonder, how important do you think was the 2013 vote and the 2013 vote about striking against the Assad regime, which went to Parliament, and Parliament said no? How important do you think that was? How influential was that in this decision?
I think because obviously that was kind of reversed in 2015, wasn't it? If memory serves. But of course, then it was strikes against ISIS or Daesh, rather than against the Assad regime. I mean, basically, I'm sure the government felt that any kind of parliamentary discussion would be horribly messy in advance of action. The thing that's happened now, of course, is that the action seems to have taken place without any real collateral fallout. And so it's a really much better climate in which the government can hold these debates. Had it been in advance of the action, then there is a possibility that certain Conservatives would have joined with Labour. However, there's a bigger possibility, I think, that the people who rebelled against Corbyn's line in the past would have actually joined with the Conservatives. So I think the government would have won the vote all right. It's just that Mrs May wanted her hands free in order to take this decision for other reasons. And I think in the end, the main reason, she knows that this is no different from all the other atrocities that Assad has perpetrated. And in the end, you know, she has just wanted to be on side with America. And in particular, she's wanted to be on side with America because France is so obviously on side with America. And, you know, in the end, if Parliament had played any part in this, it could only complicate what was a decision taken for other reasons, not about morality, not about the nature of the Assad regime, but about Mrs May and the country's relationship with these other powers, with America and France.
Sure. So what about the role of the normative in this, Mark? In the sense that, yeah, I can certainly see your point in that it's keeping allies on board, keeping positive relations with the US and France. But what about the sense that Assad has used chemical weapons, which is sort of going against an international norm, to the sense that it's the right thing to do to strike against him, to stop him from doing this, to uphold this convention, this view that no regime can use chemical weapons?
I'm sure that will have been a factor for a lot of people who support the action. However, you've got to say to yourself on the normative side, I agree that there's much at stake. If perhaps the best argument that I've heard is that the use of chemical weapons was almost being normalised in Syria because it was happening so often, and that the last thing the international community wants is the normalisation of the use of chemical weapons. But against that, from the moral side, is that all it means is that Assad will kill people with different weapons. And quite why... Sorry.
He has done. I mean, I think this is a point that's worth stressing that hasn't been made strongly enough. That yes, using chemical weapons is abhorrent. It's a truly awful way to die. It's disgusting. But Assad has also used barrel bombs. He's also used conventional weapons. And that has killed far more people than those killed by the use of chemical weapons. So there is a difference, I think, between using chemical weapons and using conventional weapons.
Yeah.
There is a difference. But the use of conventional weapons has killed far more people.
Yeah, well, quite, and the Americans would claim that the weapons that were used to destroy these facilities were themselves conventional weapons, but clearly, I mean, although nobody was killed in those attacks, one can imagine a situation where those same conventional weapons could have killed thousands of people in Syria. So, it's there's something very peculiar, I think, about this whole thing about the red lines, and for me, I think the chemical element to it, as it were, has been one element of the case which really was made for other reasons. Because, I mean, do you think there's been about 40 such attacks? I would have thought the message that sends out is that regimes can use chemical weapons with impunity so long as they don't reach a certain number. When it looks like these attacks are becoming normal, then the international community will take action. But if they look abnormal but occasional or sporadic, then you get away with it. So it's not a very clear message. The other thing we talk about is legality, Simon.
Yeah, and our colleague Professor James Sweeney in the law department wrote an excellent piece on this for the conversation that I can tweet out. He also appeared on a range of media outlets, including on BBC Breakfast. He went on the sofa and had his head powdered, much like I had to do. He went and talked to them about it. So I think we should leave that to him. And he calls the strikes, I think, legally questionable at best.
Yeah.
For a range of different reasons. But the thing that I want to just talk about, Mark, before we wrap this up, is the role of the UN.
Yeah.
And the UN seems to have been conspicuous in its absence here.
Yeah. But again, I think that's I only want to touch then marginally on the legality, but so many people would say an action is legal if it's authorised by the UN. And this does take us back to Iraq and the unreasonable use of veto that America complained about over Iraq. That in this instance, I would have thought that the use of the veto over Iraq by powers like France would be something which is quite a strong case against action, because France may have had interests in Iraq, but they're not anything like as obvious as Russia's interest in Syria. And when a power like Russia can exercise a veto over action in Syria, then it would seem to me that the UN authorization does become an impossibility.
And I think that I've made a couple of comments about this in the past week or so. The UN, for me, seems to be a moribund organization. When you've got a Security Council of an organization that was established to facilitate international peace, and you've got the main decision-making part of the organization in stalemate, unable to do anything because of its construction and organization and the prominence of veto powers, meaning that nothing can be done, no decisions can be taken whilst people are dying on the ground, 500,000 people in this case.
Yeah.
It seems that it's moribund. It can't do anything to stop it. It can't do the very thing that it was set up to do. So it does call into question the relevance of it, how useful it is, how important it is anymore. I mean, of course, it was established with some wonderful goals, and it has a certainly important role to play in a number of different fora. But this case, which is essentially its raison d'etre, it's failed.
Yeah, but obviously that means in this respect anyway, we're back to the Cold War, because the same things could be said about virtually everything of significance that happened during the Cold War, that the UN was neutralised because of veto of one side or another. But one could say that perhaps then that during the Cold War the UN's impotence was kind of understandable, and once the Cold War was over, it had its chance maybe really to establish its credentials as a worthwhile forum. And now, 20 odd years, 30 I keep forgetting when the Cold War finished, it's so long ago. 30 years since the end of the Cold War, roughly,
Yeah.
we're back to square one, and it hasn't used its opportunity. In other words, that it's still as impotent as it seemed to be in the bad old days.
Yeah, so I guess that means that Mr. Trump, Mrs. May, and Mr. Macron were left with little option for those who were suggesting that they should go to the UN. And that if they went to the UN, then the Russians would have delayed it, they would have vetoed it,
Yeah,
and it would have prevented any form of action. If that was the route that they wanted to take, then the UN would have prevented that action from taking place, which means that they had to act independently.
yeah,
Now, there is this norm within the international community of the responsibility to protect. And that was perhaps one of the things that could have been used as a means of circumventing the Security Council, circumventing the veto powers. But, of course, that hasn't been used on all of the other occasions when the Assad regime has been killing people. And I think it goes back to that discussion that we had, that brief discussion about the difference between chemical weapons and conventional weapons.
yeah. And the Russians would say that the responsibility to protect. I mean, I don't know what justification they've got for attacks, chemical or otherwise, on civilian populations, but clearly somewhere beneath their rationale for it will be a claim that the civilian populations are actually hostile, are combatants in some way, or harbouring combatants, and therefore that they are perfectly reasonable. So the responsibility to protect for them would then be being misused as a kind of way of saying we've got to protect hostile populations.
Well, I think what the Assad has very carefully and very cleverly done is frame the revolutions, the uprisings, as their very own war on terror. They were very clever to release a number of violent Islamists from their jails in the early stages of the revolution. And that helped to cultivate this narrative that's, look, here is Daesh, here is Jabhat al-Nusra, here is Jabhat al-Sham, all of these violent Islamist groups that the Assad regime could easily turn around to everyone and say, look, this isn't a popular uprising, this isn't a popular revolution, this is a violent Islamist uprising, and we need to quash it, we need to put it down. And of course, that's nonsense. There are elements in the broader revolutionary picture that are violent Islamists, but that's not the whole scene, that's not the whole picture. It's just the narrative that has been framed by the Assad regime. Yeah,
okay, well, as always when we talk about Syria, there's not an awful lot of light, because I mean these attacks may well have set back the chemical facilities, may have dealt a devastating blow, but they haven't done anything to change the reality. And perhaps the Western powers, if we call them that, will think they've put a shot across the bows really as much of as Russia, more than Assad. Assad is going to achieve what he's after anyway. He knows he can't be in more odium with the international community than he already is. But the only thing perhaps the West has achieved then is to say to Russia, you can bluster and threaten us all you want, but in the end we'll do what we want. And you could say that perhaps Russia has proved itself to be a bit of a paper tiger in this.
Yeah, so it's a slap wrist for stepping foot over a red line, whether it's proportionate or not. I mean, that's a discussion for another day. But the question of what comes next was one that I was asking a lot on Friday and in the media appearances that I've done since then. The sense of, okay, so you have this strike against various strategic sites of Syria, but then what? Assad is still killing people, he's still using conventional weapons, he will use chemical weapons again, I'm 99% sure of it. So what is going to prevent him from killing more and more people? And it seems to me that there has been a serious lack of longer-term strategic planning here. There doesn't seem to be a real plan for what comes next. Yeah. And that was the question that was really important and not properly answered. It seemed to me that this was just a punitive strike. Yeah. And that's it. There didn't seem to be anything more than that. And given that we're into the 7th year of this conflict, well, 500,000 people have been killed, 11 million displaced, etc., etc. I mean, to strike a couple of bases,
Yeah.
and that would have a serious impact on the Assad regime is nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there was something in it of Trump thinking that if the Americans could prove to Russia that they were prepared to take this kind of action, that the Russians might actually be more prepared to prod Assad into leaving, or, you know, it may help to convince the Russians that there can be no normality from their point of view in Syria, i.e. a Russian influence, Syria securely under Russian influence, that without Assad that's possible, but with Assad it's always going to be a target for hostile Western activities.
Exactly.
Which may be a possible prompt for more constructive negotiations towards a kind of solution which seems to be virtually the only one that's going to satisfy all parties. It would seem to me that all the outside parties would be satisfied with a situation where Syria was under a more lenient regime led by somebody else, and if it was still leaning towards Russia, then so be it, because it's historically been like that. Yeah, and I think the Russians would probably be reasonably happy with that. The trouble is, perhaps they would think that no leader apart from Assad can keep control of Syria. You need a tyrant, just like the Saddam Hussein thing.
Well, I mean, that's another that it's discussing another time, I think.
Yeah.
But on your plan, I think there were so many opportunities to do this. There were so many points across the past 7 years that could have been populated by this type of idea, which would have reduced the number of deaths, reduced the carnage, reduced the devastation. So I think we can certainly hope that it will bring some form of reconciliation and aid the peace talks. But I mean, let's not be overly confident or optimistic about this, I fear.
Nope. Good. Well, I think we've got 5 seconds. Is that right?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh, we've got 5 minutes. We don't really, after all that, we don't really want to talk about football. I mean, perhaps what I should say, Simon, what was the mood in America after these strikes?
I think there was a real sort of sense of America doing something, being proactive. From the people that I spoke to, there was a sense of clarity and striking on the world stage, acting responsibly, being the sort of great power. But then there were debates about what's coming next.
Right.
Amongst the I spoke to, obviously I was in a particular group of people who focused on Middle East politics, who were very policy-centred, who were interested in what was happening next, what the next stage would be, what the next part of the plan is. And there are reports that started to come out last night that Mr. Trump is trying to create an Arab force.
Led by Saudi Arabia, is it?
Yeah, strange that.
Yeah.
But an Arab force that would be comprised of the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, to go into Syria and to try and bring about a more a peace, to serve as a peacekeeping force. Right. Essentially, I guess it would be funded by those states themselves.
Iran would like that a lot, wouldn't they? Iran would be delighted by that.
Oh yeah, certainly. And so would some of their allies as well. And given the prominence of Iranian influence across that part of the world, I think that would potentially just fuel the flames rather than act to reduce tensions. Yeah. But it shows that there is an effort to try and do something a little bit different, because clearly what has been done so far has not been working, and it's just led to more devastation. And I don't think we should downplay the extent of this devastation, Mark. I mean, it's been going on for 7 years. People may be suffering from a form of Syria fatigue. The sense of this type of story has been going on, deaths in Syria, devastation, chemical weapons, etc. Yeah. But the scale of these numbers, it's abhorrent. It's beyond comprehension. It's essentially half the population of London being killed. Sorry, not half the population. Half the population of Birmingham being killed.
Yeah, well, the only difference,
London being displaced.
Yeah, well, but the difference is, I suppose, that the other thing we could be suffering from is Yemeni fatigue, but we just never hear about that at all, because the bad guy there is our ally. So, you know, because people are still saying that the Yemen conflict is even more indescribable, if you can say that,
Yes,
than the Syrian one.
it is. That will be even harder to resolve. There, of course, we've still got one of our allies engaged in a bombing campaign that's causing huge amounts of destruction to the infrastructure, and Yemen, of course, is further down the road of running out of water.
Right.
So it's much further on the path to having just a complete existential crisis of no food, no water, no infrastructure, no ability to reconcile anything. So Yemen is the other massive crisis here.
Yes, Mr. Trump won't think that any red lines have been crossed there, though, shouldn't he? But
no, chemical weapons used. It's such a redundant argument, because regardless of the type of weapons used, people are dying.
Yeah, quite. So what is the kind of main headline on news bulletins, if you've actually seen, and what would be the number one story this evening?
So the number one story in the past couple of days has been about James Comey and his book.
Right, I see, because that has had quite a bit of coverage over here.
On Syria?
That book has had a fair bit of coverage. So it's kind of the Trump factor has trumped Syria. Then Syria's moved down the headlines.
Exactly. I mean, it's still very prominent, but it's certainly been trumped, if you will, by the Comey story, and how Comey has described Mr. Trump as a mafioso, as a mob boss. It seems that he's doing his damnedest to discredit the president.
Yeah. Oh well. I'm sure he won't be the last. He certainly isn't the first.
Exactly.
Anyways, well, good. Well, very good to chat in this very bizarre way.
Likewise, Mark. Pleasure to see you. Barely.
Yeah, and there'll be time to talk about more cheerful things like the resurgence of Newcastle Football Club at the expense of Arsenal when you return, by which time there'll be more defeats notched up by your team of overachievers, the small team in London. They're doing well against the odds. Anyway, plucky underdogs, exactly. Anyway, good. Well, we shall bring this to a conclusion.
Yes.
Look forward to seeing you in a few days, and obviously we'll look forward to seeing our viewers, our faithful viewers, and doing even perhaps a slightly more orthodox program next week.
Indeed.
Bye.
Goodbye.